Good evening, everyone. We are in the last session of today. Periods don't pause for a pandemic. We have a strong panelist team of all women today. Radhika, who's the moderator. Radhika is a social entrepreneur and the social innovation and entrepreneurship catalyst at Swasti and the Catalyst Group. She has been the sexual and reproductive health lead at Swasti. She's also set up a social enterprise called Shakti that is attempting to introduce women from low income communities to sustainable menstrual management products. Through a micro enterprise model, it partners with non-profits and community institutions to help create awareness about and access to affordable, sustainable menstrual management projects. We have a lineup of speakers, Srilekha Chakrabarti, Sumegha Asthana, and Dr. Arundhati Muralidharan. Welcome you all. Over to Radhika to introduce the speakers and carry forward the session.
Thank you so much, Sudeshna, and a very warm welcome to everyone who's tuned in here today. It is truly an honor to be here on such an esteemed panel to talk about a topic that I'm clearly very passionate about. COVID-19 is probably going to go down in history as one of the most challenging periods in the history of medicine. And as with any other disaster, it's often the most physically, economically, and socially vulnerable people who are affected the most. We had repeated lockdowns, loss of income, there was no access to basic care facilities. And menstruators in community settings, frontline workers, you and I, we all had our experiences of menstruating through one of the most turbulent periods in recent history. Periods obviously don't stop for pandemics, but we'd like to use this session to reflect on the impact that the pandemic had on menstruators, their access to products and services, as well as the policy gaps that were exposed in the management of the pandemic. I'm truly honored to share this panel with an esteemed set of speakers, each of whom come with their own unique experiences and perspectives. So we'll float some questions to get started, but please leave any questions that you might have in the chat and we'll try and answer them. So before we begin, I'd like to take a quick moment to introduce our panelists to the audience. I'll start off with Srilekha Chakrabarti. Srilekha is a PhD scholar. She's a gender rights activist who's been working with tribal and marginalized communities in India. She actually runs a campaign called Period Pe Charcha that ensures mandatory menstrual hygiene services in Anganwadis for young girls in Jharkhand. She was also awarded the Web Wonder Women Award in the year 2019 by the Ministry of Women and Child Development, Twitter, and Breakthrough India for her mission in bringing a change in her community through digital platforms. Truly honored to have you here today, Srilekha. Dr. Arundhati Muralidharan is a public health professional with over 15 years of experience. She has a master's in medical and psychiatric social work and a doctorate in public health. She currently works with WaterAid India and is a passionate advocate for menstrual health and hygiene. And over the last 2 decades, she's worked on this issue at the intersection of programs, evidence generation, and policy. So she clearly brings a very unique perspective to this panel. Truly a pleasure to have you here, Dr. Arundhati. And last but not the least, Sumegha Asthana is a physician, health administrator, and a health policy and systems researcher by training. Sorry, she does so much. It's clearly a tongue twister for me here. She works at the intersection of global health governance, gender, and mainstreaming of alternative systems of medicine and public health. She's an independent public health consultant and holds honorary positions at the Institute for Public Health, Bangalore, and Queen Mary University, London, where she teaches global health policy and governance. Sumegha is also the country lead of the India chapter of a global social movement called Women in Global Health, which aims to achieve gender equality in global health leadership. Sumegha, you're clearly doing a great job. Look at this all-women's panel we have here already. Pleasure to have all of you here today. And with that, let's quickly get started with the first question for today, which comes from a story that I experienced during this pandemic. During the course of the pandemic, in the peak of the wave, I got a call, a very worried call from my domestic help, whose daughter had just grown up. And she was very concerned because she said, I don't know what to tell her. So obviously, she depended on the government and the schooling system to bring this education home to her daughter, but she herself wasn't equipped enough to do this. So with that, Srilekha, you bring in a very, very unique perspective of working with tribal communities. What were some of your insights during the pandemic? What were some of the impacts on the community itself?
Um, Hi, Radhika. Thank you for the question. And it's really amazing to be like in a panel with such amazing people. And I'm really looking forward to listening from everyone. I mean, during the pandemic, I stayed back in Jharkhand and I was working in the community. I'll start with a small story from one of the fields in Khuti, Jharkhand, where I work. So from March 2020, last year, when the government declared a lockdown, Soromati and her family received rice, one kind of pulses, salts mainly, and some oil through a distribution drive on ground that was led by government. There was no sanitary pads in the distribution kits given to her. And this was from a story when I was talking to her later when I went to the field and I was talking. She shared that Shorumati's father used to sell Ujala, that blue colored solution for clothes, pre-COVID, and has been unemployed since March 2020. So this discussion it was happening with her around November maybe. So all that Sorumati had in a house in that time was a little amount of rice that they cultivated last year, 2019, and they have been sowing lady's finger in small patches of land near a house, you know. So Sorumati shared that they have been eating lady's finger 3 times a day, like boiled, fried, and as a curry. So there was a little pause in the story, in the discussion when I was talking to her, before I asked her that how was she and her family managing their hygiene through this tough time. Every time Solomati's family would manage to get rupees 50 by selling the lady's finger, they would go and get soap for the family along with other necessity products, in which sanitary pads was not a top priority. Solomati never received sanitary pads before the lockdown, but she managed to get some money from the daily expenses of the family by which she could buy the sanitary products that she needed to buy. Since COVID, Shorumati has received 3 packets of sanitary pads only till now. And I shared this story is because now like why is Shorumati's story so important? The story over here is not about the sanitary products, and we as the activists who are working on ground is never talking about the products all the time. We're not preaching any products, but it's about the choice of hundreds of girls like Sorumati struggling to figure out the dilemma over food versus sanitation, what one would be prioritizing and spending the money on, if at all. So, period poverty is definitely real in India. And through the research and the interventions, through my campaign, Periods Pe Charcha, I've realized it gets more deep and intertwined when we are talking about the Adivasi and the marginalized, where the context of anemia and nutrition is also interlinked, adding up to the larger context of menstruation, you know. So, Radhika, I want to briefly mention one point before I pass on the mic to the other panelists is that when the lockdown started last year, a number of projects in the grassroots organizations were stopped, you know. While food security and employment took the center, a majority of the projects the initiatives that took a back step was for women and on adolescent health. Menstruation, contraceptions, accessibility to health centers for youth and adolescents on sexual reproductive health issues got a huge cut during the pandemic. Therefore, it's important to think that given any form of calamity or any form of natural disaster, what are the issues that gets priority and whose issues are always said that it can wait. Yeah, over to you, Radhika.
I love that last sentence, Srilekha. What are the issues that get priority and whose issues actually get highlighted, right? And that's really, really true. And so we're going to just quickly switch over to another group that often got ignored. So in India, women make up a significant percentage of all healthcare workers and more than 80% of nurses and midwives. Yet, when it comes to decision making roles in the health sector, they're largely absent. They get paid much less than their male counterparts as well. Actually, only 13% of the members of the National COVID-19 Task Force are women. So, Sumekha, what do you think are the implications of this on the experience of menstruators amongst the frontline workers? They're obviously a large part of the frontline workforce.
Thanks, Radhika. First of all, thank you for inviting me to this exciting and important discussion. And secondly, thanks for the question. I love to talk about health workers issues. But you've summed it all, right? So health workers constitute the majority of the health workforce. They were at the front line, starting from the ashas to Anganwadi workers to distributing take-home rations to other necessities, doing surveillance, contact tracing, and everything. But when it came to PPEs, they were made for male bodies. No one even thought that women are going to wear those PPEs. Women health workers had a really, really tough time adjusting to the PPEs, which were made for 6 feet tall men, where they didn't have, they were not even suited. They had a difficult time to relieve themselves during the day, forget menstrual hygiene and health largely. And they were in those suits for 24 hours, and I'll talk about this later, but just a small intervention here is that it was an afterthought that these suits should also be adjusted to the female bodies and the requirement of their bodies, including relieving themselves in the day, changing, and of course, maintaining menstrual hygiene. So this had implications on their work, this had implications on the stress and anxieties, this had implications on various other roles that they perform, domestically and professionally. This was anyway a very difficult time, so this had implications for their mental well-being as well as the physical well-being. And I often ask myself, how could we miss it? When our whole response was dependent on this large workforce that we keep shouting about, the frontline health workers. But when it comes about making policies or devising strategies, we just conveniently forget them. Forget forgiving. We just conveniently forget. More on that. I'll take a pause here. Thank you.
Thanks, Sumika. Such a powerful statement. We're often an afterthought. I'm going to hold on to that for a while. So, Dr. Arundhati, coming to you then, obviously there were challenges. Obviously, the challenges have been highlighted so beautifully by Sumika and Srilekha. What was the response from the government, from civil society organizations? What was the response to this crisis?
Thank you, Radhika, and thank you also to Piramal for this session. So just taking up from where Sumika left off, which is, yes, I think that women in the health workforce across cadres were a left out group and an afterthought for sure. But we also saw that from the first wave of the pandemic last year to this wave of the pandemic, last year we heard these voices of women. There were videos, there were statements that were being made that their concerns were not being addressed, especially their own personal health needs. But when we saw the second wave this year, we did not see much improvement. So we lost a window of opportunity where, yes, women's voices were suddenly heard, the women workforce, the health force. But then we didn't do much in those 6 months that we had in between where we could have taken action to improve their ability to be able to manage their own personal health. And again, for 3 months, they were thrown into intense work schedules, where again, they found themselves in the same situation, but this time, their struggles were not heard. So I think that's one thing that we need to be cognizant of as we're moving into a potential third wave or future issues that whether ashas, Anganwadi workers, nurses, sanitation workers, whoever's involved in any kind of frontline response, we can't keep forgetting about their needs and let it be heightened for only a certain period of time. We need to be cognizant that this has to be a shift that we need to make. So I think that the COVID pandemic actually, we saw a lot more discussion on various aspects which possibly received attention on certain global days, Menstrual Hygiene Day, Global Hand Washing Day. And the pandemic kind of made us realize that these are not issues that can be addressed or spoken about or so-called celebrated on certain days, but this needs to be a part of ongoing policy, ongoing interventions, and ongoing research. And I think menstrual hygiene was one of them. And the big shift I think that we saw, and personally that's been important for me, is we're slowly making a shift away from menstrual hygiene management to menstrual health. It's not just hygiene, it is our health. It's the health of all of those who experience menstruation. And that's a really critical distinction, and one that's going to inform our policy and practice and even research as we move forward in the coming years. I think in terms of response, we see the response in terms of big gaps that were starkly highlighted at this time, in terms of awareness of being able to provide information and support on various aspects related to menstruation, on access to products, which is one thing that received a lot of highlighting at that time. But of course, it was overwhelmingly focused on sanitary pads. But later I can come in and talk about how it's made some of us realize the greater importance of choice of products, and making sure that girls and women, like contraceptives, we have access to a basket of products. It's made us realize that there are issues, that menstrual health is not a standalone issue. It's very much connected to other issues that girls, women, and other menstruators face, whether it's violence, whether it's access to education, whether it's access to other sexual and reproductive health services. And it's time that we begin building those linkages between these. We've also seen a highlighting of the relationship between one emergency and another. So last year and this year, we've seen that states such as West Bengal, Orissa, Kerala, Andhra Pradesh, they experienced floods, cyclones, and we saw that communities, both urban and rural, suddenly had a double burden or even a triple burden. You had COVID, you had disasters, and they were all coming together. And therefore, in terms of even our disaster preparedness or emergency preparedness and response, we need to be taking into consideration the needs of girls, women, and others who menstruate. So I think that's another thing that was highlighted and has begun to see some kind of response. And as Sumekha and Shilekha pointed out, this also, we've realized that there are some groups that have suffered more, and that have been sidelined. And these could be groups who are traditionally more marginalized, more vulnerable, but also groups that may not be so-called traditionally marginalized. So if you look at, female nurses, female doctors, we think of them as leading efforts in healthcare. So why do we need to look at them and their needs? Why do, their personal health needs? But now we realize that menstruators, whichever kind of, wherever you fall on that socio-economic ladder, our needs need to be heard and addressed. So I think that's another important thing that's been highlighted. And last, I'll just end with this point, is the whole thing on this year. For a very brief period of time, we heard this linkage between vaccination and menstruation and COVID, and how people who have suffered from COVID, and how their menstrual cycles have been deeply affected, either due to the disease or due to treatment. And this has kind of, it was raised and it was discussed perhaps for a week on social media, but there's been no concerted attention that has been done to address these issues. Women who we've spoken with who have had COVID and suffering from some kind of long symptoms or long COVID are reporting changes in menstrual cycle or more difficulties in their menstruation, as well as other kind of reproductive issues. We need to start discussing these, and instead of like pushing it under the carpet. So again, it's highlighted that there is a deeper link with our health and women's health. And I think that's something that we should try and kind of dig a little deeper and listen to women's voices. And this is where I think I love what Gunj says about this. Listen to the voices of people. And I think we need to do a little more of that. So I'll end here, Radhika. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Dr. Arundhati. So much to take away, but I'm going to try to break that down a little bit. So what I'm hearing is that obviously the system failed. The system failed menstruators, not just the first time around, but also the second time around. And in situations like that, often people find their own means, right? You're forced to find your own means. So just going back to Srilekha, what did the community do at this point? The systems failed them. Civil society organizations were obviously doing their very best. But how did they respond? What were some of the interesting trends that you saw coming out from your interactions with the community? How did they react and respond?
So Thank you, Radhika, for this question again. I think, if we talk about adaptation, I don't think that they have. I don't think I have. I don't think you have. We are even not so equipped with all other knowledge around COVID. Every new day, government is passing up that even the COVID vaccine dates are changing frequently. In that situation, I think it's too much of a pressure to already think and even reimagine that the communities will adapt or will accept that so easily. First of all, because I can again bring back to the stories that I get from the community, and I will just say a bit on Hindi as what I get calls. I keep getting calls from adolescents and youth telling me that दीदी आप कब से शुरू करोगे, कुछ तो करो, आके पेंटिंग कराओ गांव में, क्योंकि यहाँ पे सबका मेंटल हेल्थ का सिचुएशन बहुत खराब है, आप लोग प्लीज आओ. So again, if the programs are not being channelized onto the youth perspective, then how are the grassroots organizations over there going to live up to the expectations for this? I feel as a person working on ground, I feel that our work, we have actually gotten more delayed for 10 years, because organizations and communities, what they did, it was more about bringing everybody together and meeting up and gaon mein, sitting there and everything. Right now everything is getting more fragmented, and we can't do that interactions also. So I think thinking about that, of having how communities will adapt, is a total different thing, because even till February, when I was on ground, there are many communities I was trying, when I was asking them what does COVID mean, they said that they were like, kuch to छुआछूत की बीमारी होगी. So then I realized that are we even talking about the caste and the entire concept of purity and pollution also associated to this? Are the IC materials that government is talking about, that we are even in organizations also we are trying to bring in, how much is it actually being translated into the language that the communities even will understand? Are we even taking that up? So I think it would definitely take a lot more time. We have to keep on on ground, people like us, we have to keep on these kind of discussions alive, push people and keep on pushing that yes, health issues are also equally important, and menstruation is a public health issue. It is not a women's only issue. So yeah, I end up there.
Thank you. That's so true. It's not just a women's issue, right? Thanks, Srilekha. So Megha, there's a lot to learn when we look outside, right? Looking at the context, not just in our country, but learning from other countries. From your experience, and because you have country-specific chapters as well, what were some specific learnings that we can take away from and adapt to the Indian context as well? How did other countries deal with this?
Thanks, Radhika. So just to put things into the context, we're talking about around 800 million individuals who menstruate every single day, who've been struggling with the unique issues that the pandemic has posed. And out of these, 500 million around were already finding it difficult to cope with the needs of menstruation. Period poverty, Srilekha and Arundhati has talked about, is so true, and this is not just true for the sub-Saharan African context, but also in our context and even the developed ones. In the US, 1 out of 5 girls have been reported to have missed schools because of lack of access to period products. In UK, 1 out of 10 girls have been reported to have missed schools for the similar reasons. And of course, all other health issues, the ones who are the most impacted are the vulnerable populations, those who are more prone to the economic and the social shock. And this was not unique to the COVID pandemic. So as per the Plan India survey in 24 countries, it was found that 81% of the respondents reported to said that they were concerned that the menstruators would not be supported to meet their needs. And about 75% reported that COVID-19 will pose increased health risk for individuals. Now, talking about the impact, and Arundhati has already mentioned the direct impacts. So categorizing it as the primary and the secondary. The primary, of course, has been highlighted by the previous speakers, are more at the biological level, straight, wherein There have been reports of hair and painful menstrual flow, changes in menstrual cycles because of stress, anxiety, malnutrition, disturbed sleep patterns, disturbed routines and physical exercises, and so on. But for a moment, if we keep that aside, and of course there's very sketchy evidence on what is the gravity of these impacts and how much and to what level. But let's talk about the secondary impact, or what I also call as the avoidable impact, which has resulted from what we can call as the structural and the social changes, the inequalities and the discrepancies, which has happened because more and more people were pushed into extreme poverty during the pandemic, which has happened because there have been decline in social services, including access to education, including access to IC resource materials and so on, decreased access to schools and community platforms where we were accessing period products and other menstrual health and hygiene products. And most importantly, and this has been mentioned by the previous speakers, in terms of diversion of resources, the limited resources which were now going, one, the money, which was in hand, and two, I believe the biggest resource, the water, which got diverted to hand washing in COVID, taking away the needs from the menstrual health hygiene. The impacts, of course, varied from country to country and all the social groups, and depending on which level of the social pyramid they fall. But what has been interesting, however, is that there are also learnings. There are a lot of learnings across the level of institutions, ranging from individuals to CSOs to groups to self-help groups to NGOs to governments to global partners and so on, the range of actors involved, as well as the aspects in which they've been addressing. So looking at and observing the trends, I've seen there have been interventions across all aspects, including addressing the stigma and the taboos, addressing, of course, the disrupted access to information, access to wash infrastructure, not so much, but there have been attempts, and of course the period products. Talking about learnings in terms of addressing stigma and taboos, there have been various initiatives. The one that I've been following is the pandemic periods. A wonderful group of volunteers who've come across from different parts of the world to ensure that menstrual health hygiene is not forgotten during the pandemic. They have taken the forms of storytellings to raise the visibility of the suboptimal menstrual health. And have been involved in action-oriented advocacy. About period products, there is a range starting from individuals like Diane from Mumbai who made us all proud, about Yannick Branford, the Canada activist, who's been very popular about providing period products and creating awareness. Individuals, self-funded CSOs and NGOs. I've been reading about the End Period Project of High Cholera Research Funding Foundation. They've been distributing period pads to low income young girls in the program in Haiti and Florida. CSOs, I recently read about how a group of NGOs in Chile came together. NGOs working on different aspects of menstrual health and hygiene got together, got a local politician on board, met with the Minister of Gender, and made provisions to provide period products to those who were living at the streets and in prisons. There are wonderful inspiration stories. Of course, the government, Scotland made us all proud to be the first country to provide free period products, totally from tax-funded money. France, Mexico, Kenya, they all have been examples. And of course, our country ourselves, that we've also stepped up to provide period products. Sanitary naps, which I hate calling, with the negative connotation of unclean blood, lack of better words, the period products, the period pads, During COVID, countries have also adapted to include period products in the overall relief package. For example, the American COVID aid package allowed people to use their health spending accounts to include menstrual materials. Others have advocated to remove sales taxes from these products. There is no dearth of inspiration. And and I'm sure we'll discuss in this sessions, that there is no dearth of inspirations from within our own country. The role of global actors, the work of UNICEF, the work of Plan International, the work of many other large donors, the Global Menstrual Collective cannot be discounted at all. But what I really want to bring to this forum is that when we look at these initiatives, when we analyze, we observe these initiatives, certainly they are inspiring and exemplary work, but can we rely on these individual efforts? Can we rely on these self-funded individual efforts of selected CSOs or NGOs or self-motivated, organizations to sustain ensuring menstrual health and hygiene? I feel ultimately the responsibility should lie with the state to ensure menstrual health and hygiene of its population. We certainly can learn from Scotland and use the taxpayer money to provide services as well as the infrastructure. The second thing that kind of I would bring to the forum is the disproportionate focus, and the previous speakers have actually talked about it as well, the disproportionate focus on period products. We really need to move beyond this ad hoc supply of period products as if that kind of ends everything. There are multiple issues therein. And what we really need to do is to move beyond this supply gap fixing kind of mechanism to address the broader structural and social barriers which hamper menstruators to maintain uh, menstrual health and hygiene. By structural and social barriers, I'm certainly talking about the structural barriers associated with the wash infrastructure and the social barriers associated with addressing stigma and taboos. I've spoken a lot. I'll take a pause, but I really want to talk about this in more detail if we get more time. Over.
Thanks, Sumika. That was very insightful, and it's so inspiring to know that there are initiatives out there that were successful, that continue to be successful. But at the core of it lies the institutional support of a state, right? And without that, any impact is only as large as the extent of funding available or the extent of the people involved in that. Um, Great. So just moving a little bit further into this topic, you know, Dr. Aditi, you talked a little bit about the programming around menstrual health. I'm not going to say management because that was a great point you made around menstrual health initiatives. Uh, COVID was obviously disruptive to the way we work, disruptive to the way we live. How can it be disruptive to the way we design menstrual health programs? Could you give us 2 or 3 tangible ideas? Because obviously, everyone here listening is likely either in the space or interested in it. Who knows? You might inspire someone to have the next big thing. So, over to you.
I certainly hope so, Radhika. I think there's a lot of potential that we've seen so many people do such innovative kind of initiatives as a result of COVID. It's a great question. And I think that it has been disruptive. It has forced us to kind of change the way we're thinking about menstrual health programming in some ways. And I think that we now need to make it like a it shouldn't just be responsive, but it should be something that's ingrained and continued. So one is that we've had to change the way that we provide information and support to menstruators. We've so far done it, I mean, through our traditional, say, government programs. It's mostly we've provided information in schools, many organizations, NGOs at a community level in schools. But I think that we've had to change when direct contact, which many of our interventions rely on to provide information, awareness, rely on direct contact. And COVID has kind of disrupted that. We've seen some great examples come out, and they do have their limitations, but they're also examples of how quickly organizations were trying to respond to the ground realities. So in many urban areas, especially in urban slums, we saw that there were like these digital platforms that came up, suddenly information available in as many local languages as possible for girls and women, and even for some transgenders to get information on menstruation, reproductive health, sexual health. So we saw these digital platforms come up. They were more in the urban space than in the rural space. There was one, we saw a telephone helpline called Hello Saheli that came up, which was just to call, and a toll-free number was provided that you could call from any kind of phone to get information, not just on menstrual health, but also on reproductive and sexual health. Again, a really important initiative that came up, recognizing that people's mobility, especially those of girls and women, was highly limited. What's interesting in these initiatives, both like a digital platform and these telephonic helplines, is that they moved beyond menstrual hygiene and started connecting it with other issues of violence, of abuse, of sexual and reproductive health, of contraceptive needs, pregnancy loss. So they realized that all these issues are interconnected for girls and women. You cannot deal with one because people are going to ask questions about other issues as well. So I think that was a really good example of how that shift in thinking towards health started happening. Second, as Sumega said, that it's forced us to really rethink products, menstrual hygiene materials. It's high time that we realize that we need a basket of choice. Yes, sanitary pads are one important product. I'm not denying that they're important. I'm not anti-sanitary pad. But I think the pandemic also made us realize that we need to make sure that menstruators have knowledge and hopefully moving ahead access to different types of product. Similar to what Srilekha said, when the pandemic struck, towards end of March, we started getting calls. I started getting calls that girls who were in schools and who were completely dependent on school-based supply of pads, whether in rural India or urban India, suddenly had nothing. And they were panicking. What do we use? And these were young girls, 15, 16, 17-year-olds that never used a cloth pad in their lives. They had no idea how to do it. They've completely been dependent on the school-based supply of sanitary pads. And while this has been a good government initiative to make these pads available, the flip side is that when you don't have supply, when supply is interrupted for any reason, any kind of issue, what do you do? And suddenly we were scrambling for, how do you explain how to make a cloth pad on the phone? They found it uncomfortable. They didn't know how to wash it. They were queasy about washing a cloth pad. So, but had we actually focused on providing information on products to include cloth pads, to include menstrual cups, some of these difficulties in switching to another product could have been avoided. We've heard from organizations during the pandemic who have shown remarkable success with introducing a menstrual cup to rural India, to rural women in Gujarat, in Rajasthan. And you would think that these are conservative societies where they're completely opposed to using an insertion product. But they've got great examples of how this can be introduced, how it's of great value. Again, making us realize that when you introduce products to girls and women, they understand what could meet their bodies. It's not about us making a choice for them. They are fully capable. We're all fully capable of making choices of what suits our bodies, our needs, our ability to pay, the context in which we live. And I think that's, again, the pandemic has realized, I hope forced us to realize this basket of choice needs to be the way forward. I think there are lots of other kind of issues that this has highlighted. The other thing is, I think in terms of large-scale government programming and any kind of large-scale programming, government as well as non-government, including use of CSR funds, which has been since 2015 has been directed towards girls and menstrual hygiene. We need to rethink this. How are we doing it? Are we going to focus on products? But can we actually rethink the model towards a more comprehensive approach towards menstrual health? We know that what we've learned over the past decade of menstrual hygiene programming is that it's a good entry way to start talking about reproductive and sexual health with girls. So is it a time that we rethink this programming to be a wider kind of adolescent health and women's health? It's also important. A lot of our menstrual hygiene programming in India is focused on adolescent girls for good reason, for very good reason. But we cannot now, we need to now take this to women, to menstruators along the across the reproductive life course. Whether you're a young woman, whether you're a woman who's just given birth, whether you're premenopausal, we need to now expand this to menstruators of all ages. Lastly, I think that we need to rethink distribution mechanism for menstrual hygiene products? Is it only schools and health centers and Anganwadi centers? But how can we engage this rather large and lively movement that we have of community-based groups, self-help groups that are manufacturing sanitary pads? Yes, but can they also be capacitated, leveraged to provide information, provide support, and also get into the introduction of alternative products? I think they have a big role to play here. So I think these are some of the good things that have happened. I'll end with one great example, which I think is an indicator of how government can be very progressive if they themselves have the knowledge and access to resources. Now, at WatchIt, we've been working with the government of Madhya Pradesh for a number of years at a very, I think they've taken a lot of progressive action. Now, with menstrual hygiene, they've also been one of the states that has taken a large initiative on board. Since 2015, we've also been talking about the need to expand the product basket. But last year, the Department of Women and Child Development got back to us saying that our girls are calling us, our Anganwadi Karyakartas are calling us and telling us that pads are not available. What do? We know cloth pads are the answer. We know Madhya Pradesh has a large proportion of girls and women who continue to use cloth. Help us communicate how they can use this hygienically, safely. And it was such a turning moment. Within a week, they made sure that they got access to videos, to kind of instructions with the help of Jatan Sansthan, a wonderful NGO in Rajasthan, on how to make your own cloth pad and make it kind of comfortable, aspirational, something that even young girls would like to use. And the government has picked it up and they've rolled it out. And they provided kind of training on cloth pad usage to over 90,000 Anganwadi Karyakartas across Madhya Pradesh. And that is a fantastic example of how government can really change the way we think about this. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Arundhati. It's such a high to end your section with, because I think it's really important to recognize when there's a government out there doing something good, and kudos to the government of Madhya Pradesh to actually implement this. And just adding to what you're saying as well, we've spoken a lot about the intersections of gender-based violence, food and nutrition, SRHR programming, etc. Can we leverage these intersections to actually grow the menstrual health agenda as well, versus keeping them in silos? So with that, I'm cognizant that we have a lot of questions that we have to get into. So maybe, let's start off with something that Srilekha was talking about. So Srilekha, there's a question here that talks about the choice of food over sanitation. What change of policy reform is expected to bring it about without any change in personal thinking? So maybe you could try to answer this question in the context of the work that you've done.
Okay, there's thunderstorm outside, so it might be a bit of disrupted what I'm speaking or in the internet. But I just try to take up this question in what I understand. First of all, there should not be any choice between food and sanitation. Like, absolutely not. And that's exactly the entire story that I brought over here. That today we have to take a choice in that. There has been schools. There has been schools in the tribal belt where girls could study from class 6 to the standard 12. They used to get good nutrition over there. They used to get sanitary pads, accessibility of everything, and now they are all back home, and there's a total shutdown, and now they don't have both, like not food, neither the understanding of sanitation. To the question of policy reform, what I really want to share is that so for example, we had Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, and that's an entire another, I think we need to have another session on that. Swachh Bharat Abhiyan was about to give comprehensive hygiene and sanitation for the people in rural India. But did this understanding of sanitation also took into consideration menstrual hygiene? It was not. Like, we did not. We saw hundreds of wall writings around in the walls during the entire campaign, and it was beautifully done on why we need to have toilets. And it's such a amazing medium. As I was talking about the language, right? Like, wow, it's such an amazing medium to reach out to semi-literate population, to semi-literate population with these kind of wall writings. But then there was none around menstrual hygiene. There was none around menstruation. That was totally silent. So I think I just want to end this up by saying that policy reform, yes, there has been. It's important, but how are we also taking into consideration the little things now what we have? Like, do we have comprehensive sexual education in schools? Are in the pandemic, when we are having the Zoom calls, our teachers? I was talking to my cousins, and I realized that, are the teachers talking about mental health, about sexual abuse, or about menstrual hygiene practices also during their calls? Is this little changes are also happening in the system itself? Not. And then we can definitely move on to a bigger policy reform. But I'm saying that policy reforms has been there. But as we have Janani Suraksha Yojana reaching out to all women, we have the polio campaign reaching out to everyone. Do we have certain similar programs reaching out to every corners and every terrains through the campaigns that government is running or the policies that we are making? And until then, if we are not putting the similar kind of effort in advertising, the similar kind of effort in campaigning for adolescent health also, I don't think, and we will still be treated as a forgotten amidst the pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks, Shrika. So true. I think it's just about spotlighting it, right? We've really got to give it the kind of attention it truly deserves. Which sort of brings me to the next question. That's a very relevant question, and it's an ideal, right? So Sumegha, maybe you can take a stab at answering this. What could be done to achieve a gender conscious or a sensitive health system? I can see you rolling your eyes over there. So,
Thank you. Wonderful question. The moot question, and we can write a thesis on it. But it's actually not very complicated. It's fairly simple. Our health systems, our societies are just a reflection of ourselves as individuals, as families, as extended families, and then expanding to the larger communities and so on. So the way we treat women in our households, our health systems treat women. The way we treat our young girls, the way we curb their ambitions, the health systems curb the ambitions of the female health workers. As I said, it's fairly uncomplicated. We just have to create that change. And let me remind everyone that the change will never be served to you on a platter. You have to ask for it. So the change will come when there is action from both sides, from the top as well as from the bottom. When we ask for our rights, first, when we recognize that this is our right, first, we should be aware that, we can be ambitious. I can be ambitious doing my PhD after I got married and had 2 kids. You can be ambitious and not get married at all and continue with your own dreams. When we can make our own choices and assert. When health workers can make their own choices and assert for their rights, when they can demand that we will not work till the time we are not given the PPPs which are suited to our body. We will not work till the time we are not protected from the violence which we meet on every day on the roads, walking inside the homes of, during surveillance and contact tracing. We will not work till the time we are not giving protection from the midnight calls that we get from the contacts that we are transporting to the quarantine facilities. We have to ask. We have to get aware. We have to ask. We have to assert. And 2, at the top level, we have to have that kind of consciousness. A beginning could be just to listen to the women, what they want. And even if you can't reach to each and every women at the community level, start listening to the women health workers at least. They are the closest to the communities. Start listening to them because they know their communities, they know the issues of their communities. For God's sake, trust their knowledge. Trust their expertise, trust their tacit knowledge, and devise policies on their knowledge and not on your supranational knowledge alone. I'm not saying that is not important, that's very much important. But what is also important is to be connected to the communities. And we have the biggest link of the community health workers, necessarily not the female health workers, also the male health workers. But there has to be a link in the systems wherein the needs of one another is, uh, permeating. So, so this is what we can do. We can create a push from the bottom. We can extend a supporting hand from the above. And trust me, equality is not too far. We have come a long way, and we're just few more milestones away. The moment we'll start including that in our homes, we will start seeing those reflections in our societies at large.
Thanks, Sumega. Such a powerful statement and the perfect emoji that went up on my screen at the moment. And I think you've really answered the other question that we also had around taboo and stigma attached to women, right? You're right, it is a reflection of everything that we represent as a society. And until or unless we make those decisions, I mean, charity starts at home is what they say, right? And until we make those decisions and those asks and those demands at home, nothing's going to change. I sadly have just 5 minutes left, so I'm going to try and summarize this beautiful discussion in a couple of points that were my key takeaways. Firstly, we've talked a lot about products. Products need to be a choice. So for anyone in programming, for anyone working with communities, keeping in mind that there is not just one ideal solution and that women can and will choose what works best for them, and to trust them to be able to make those decisions, but present them with all the choices because that is in their best interest as well. The second point that I took away from this was something that Dr. Aranti said. We need to move away from the MHM terminology and move more into looking at menstrual health as a broad topic, because that has so many intersections with food, nutrition, gender-based violence, all these different aspects that come into the picture when we talk about menstrual health in itself. Thirdly, what Sri Lekha said, menstrual health is not a women's issue. It is a public health issue. And the quicker we start to recognize that, the better recognition that we're going to get for it as well. Thirdly, talking about menstrual health management programming and all the great examples that Sumega brought to the table, as well as Dr. Arundhati brought to the table. Clearly, there are successes out there. How can we document these successes better? How can we highlight these successes better? But more importantly, what are some of the disruptive things that we as individuals who work with communities, who work with policymakers, can actually bring to the table in order to change the way we're looking at menstrual health as a whole? And lastly, for me, these points around, the impact of COVID on our bodies and our experience as menstruators. Periods definitely don't stop for a pandemic, but a pandemic does affect your period. So stop looking at women as an afterthought. We are 50% of this population, and we deserve to be as documented in all aspects of our body as anyone else. So with that, I request Dr. Arundhati, Sumega, Sri Lekha, any last thoughts or comments? We have 3 minutes more before we close out. Yes, Sumega.
Very quick one. I just want to end saying, that if during the pandemic we could ramp up production of masks, sanitizers overnight, we could aggressively market for hand washing, behavior change. We could do it for menstrual health as well. It's just about getting the priorities right, prioritizing the needs of certain population. There's nothing that is not achievable. So let's get going, because now we know that it is possible.
Thank you. Any last comments, Dr. Arundhati and Sri Lekha?
So, yeah. So there was this one question I could see which talks about how the taboo and stigma attached to menstruation talks about the women's status. I would just like to end this thought that I think it adds up to the politics of space that we talk about mobility of the spaces that we can access, and it again gets back to the understanding of the gender system that we're talking about. How the myth around menstruation stops us from getting into a space. Yeah, that was my last thought.
Thank you, Sri Lekha.
Radhika, I'll actually end with one thought that you you asked in the question, which is this whole thing of disruption. COVID has disrupted stuff. It's allowed us or made us think about things in different ways, and that's important. But it's only valuable if our change in thinking and approach is not just responsive, but it's something that we see as that we want to institutionalize and really see that change through. It cannot just be an emergency response. So I think that whether it's menstrual health or any other aspects of health of women and girls, it's something that we need to see through as and keeping that long-term vision in mind. So I'd like to say that. The last thing is actually on something that Sumedha said, which is that for bringing about a change towards gender equity in communities, you need to have that the push from the bottom and also from the top. I think that as women, I think we also need to figure out how we can support each other. Women leaders need to figure out how can we create future women leaders. I mean, I think we don't do enough of that, and we really must. It's an all-woman panel, and I think that it's a responsibility for us, for all of us at any age, to kind of figure out how we can support each other and also future generations of girls and women to rise up, to voice their needs, voice their rights. Thank you.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Dr. Arundhati. Sumika, last.
And not perpetuate the inequalities that we've been the victim of.
Thank you. With that, I request everyone who's watching to please stay for the plenary session at 7:15 today. It's around resilient health, and I'm definitely going to be watching. There's an incredible panel of speakers, so do stay on. And we have some really interesting sessions happening tomorrow as well. So looking forward to seeing all of you there as well. So Deshna, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for this power-packed session, for bringing the menstruators' issues on the forefront. Actually, hearing their voices through all of you has been so enriching. It's been a wonderful experience. So we realize that it's indeed important that we do not forget them and their challenges, especially during the pandemic when there are disruption of services. Thanks once again for bringing this in front of us so lucidly, and look forward to meet audience again at the plenary session today, and look forward to have you all tomorrow as well. Bye. Good evening.